Welcome to the Harry Garland podcast with me, your host, Harry. I created this podcast to, at its core, shine a light on the intelligent minds within advanced academia and the incredible research they are pioneering. I find it fascinating that there are thousands of people dedicating their lives to what they believe to be an essential piece of the puzzle within this complicated and dynamic world. Within these episodes, I'll be sitting down with such people to explore these niche puzzle pieces they are crafting in a way that is hopefully accessible and valuable to anyone who wishes to listen. There is no limit to the topic, person, or ideas we will explore. In fact, I hope to sit and learn from the widest variety of people I possibly can, and I'm very grateful you have chosen to sit with me along this journey. So thank you. Now, for today's episode, I've had the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Stephen Sharman, a research fellow at the University of King's College, London. His research is primarily focused within gambling behaviour and gambling-related harm, and he is the first behavioural addictions-focused research fellow within the National Addiction Centre. Dr. Sharman is an incredibly intelligent and kind man who was very generous with his time, and for that, I'm truly thankful. I found our conversation incredibly interesting, and I hope you do too. So, without further ado, Episode 1, Dr. Stephen Sharman. 20th century playwright Wilso Meisner wrote, "Gambling, the sure way of getting nothing for something." Is gambling a net bad? We'll start light.
Yeah, this is not philosophical. Inherently, no. Gambling as a behaviour has been, we've seen it for many, many centuries across different civilizations. So it's not an uncommon behaviour. The gambling itself, I don't think, is inherently bad. What sometimes is bad is the consequences of too much gambling, right, and perhaps some of the ways in which the gambling industry treats gamblers and promotes some of its products. But generally, I don't actually believe that gambling itself is inherently bad.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. When it comes to gambling, I guess it's been around for so long, like you say. At what point does an activity just become gambling? Is it merely when there's a stake involved, or?
It depends on what the definition of gambling is that you use. So we tend to work towards the definition, or work to a definition, which is placing something of value on an outcome, on an event whose outcome is uncertain in the hope of gaining something of greater value. So it's essentially, there has to be an element of risk and there has to be an element of chance. And as soon as you're risking something of value, where there's an uncertain outcome, in the hope of gaining something of greater value, then that then becomes gambling.
Interesting. So you studied psychology at UEL.
Correct.
For your undergrad, and then you did your master's in cognitive neuroscience at UCL.
That's right.
And your PhD in experimental psychology at Cambridge.
Yep.
At what point along that journey did you start to gain an interest into, because I guess this comes into the category of behavioural addictions.
That's right.
So at what point along there did you start to take an interest into the field?
Pretty early, actually. So I can tell you the exact moment that happened. Actually, it was during the final year of my undergraduate degree at the University of East London. I was doing a module on addiction and addictive behaviours. And Henrietta Bowden-Jones, who runs the National Problem Gambling Clinic in London, came to do a guest lecture on gambling. Now, I was already interested in addiction. I was already thinking that that's probably where I wanted to kind of focus my future directions. But I'd never really come across or considered the fact that behaviours could be considered addictions. So that was a really eye-opening moment. And from there, I emailed Henrietta and said, "Can I come and do some work with you at the National Problem Gambling Clinic?" And she said no. But I just kind of then just said, didn't really take no for an answer and kind of hassled out to the point of it being a bit annoying. Yeah. And eventually she said, "Fine, come and meet me for a coffee. We'll have a chat." we had a chat, got on really well. So then started working at the National Problem Gambling Clinic as a research assistant on a voluntary basis. And then during my master's, I did my thesis. My dissertation was on decision making in gamblers.
Okay.
And then halfway through the master's, I'd already secured the funding for the PhD, so I knew that was going to be looking at gambling and gambling behaviour as well. So yeah, I'd say right from towards the end of my undergraduate degree, I'd had an interest in gambling and gambling behaviour.
And the master's was 1 year?
Master's was just the 1 year. Yeah, it was a slightly unusual time in that it was August to August, more or less, and I knew that I was going to start my PhD the next year by December.
Okay.
So it was only a third of the way through a master's that I have to be honest, I wasn't particularly enjoying, but knew that I just had to get to the end and pass it, and then I could go away and go back to kind of what I wanted to do, the experimental stuff, and start the PhD.
When you went to UCL, so remind me, so the lady that came to do the talk, she was at UCL? Or where was she?
No. So she's, Henrietta runs she's I think she'll kill me if I get it wrong. She's a psychiatrist.
Okay.
I should probably check that before we actually use that.
We might believe it.
No, she's a medical doctor, I believe a psychiatrist with a focus in addictions. And she did do, I believe at the time she was related to Imperial University and did some kind of teaching there. But she's primarily a clinician.
Okay.
Yeah.
So who kind of guided you along that path from UEL to UCL? Was that just from your own aspiration?
So that was just because I mean, it's funny how the sequence of events. So I'd already chosen my undergraduate dissertation before I'd done the addictions module. So my undergraduate dissertation was actually on memory loss and amnesia.
Okay.
I was very interested at that stage in traumatic brain injuries and the impact that has on cognitive functions.
Right.
So because of that, I wanted to do a neuroscience master's. So I had already applied to the cognitive neuroscience masters at UCL. Mm-hmm. And then I did the addictions module and then met with Henrietta, started working at the clinic and thought, hold on a minute, I want to go kind of a bit more down this direction.
Yeah.
Now I was able to combine the interest in the behaviour addictions with the kind of the cognitive side of the cognitive neuroscience masters.
Right.
But yeah, that was the path, was more that I had applied for the course that was available in cognitive neuroscience. And also, I was living in London and at that time didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay in London. So I was only really looking at master's courses kind of in the London, offered by the various London universities, because I didn't want to leave.
Why? Can you go straight into a postgrad from undergrad? Is that?
From a undergraduate course to a master's course?
Into a doctorate.
Oh, no. Right. I think you can, but I think it's relatively unusual.
Right.
So you're unlikely to go straight from an undergraduate degree to a 3-year master's. Now, there are sort of courses called 1+3s, where there are 4-year PhDs, but the first year is a master's. So the master's is kind of incorporated into the doctorate.
And yours was 3 as a doctorate?
So mine was just a pure 3-year doctorate, because I had already done the master's, kind of giving me some sort of methodological and sort of statistical training that I was able to take forward into my PhD.
How do we define experimental psychology? What comes under that?
So I sometimes describe it as, when I tell people what I do, I say, it's exactly what you think an experimental psychologist might do, which is put people in a room, stick wires to them, make them do stuff, see what happens. Yeah. I mean, that's a fairly kind of flippant response. That's not really what it is. So the experimental psychology is very much looking at running experiments to see what influences behaviour. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if I want to know, I do a lot of work looking at things called near misses, and if I want to look at what percentage of spins that near misses drives persistent behaviour, I'll keep everything else constant, and then I'll manipulate that one variable and see how that change in that one particular variable influences the outcome variable, which is the behaviour. So it's very much kind of retaining experimental control over the environment in which the research is done, and changing just one specific thing and looking at how that changes behaviour.
Do you have much autonomy in your doctorate to be able to choose and lead, or?
That's a very good question with a simple and a complicated answer.
Okay.
So the simple answer is yes. I feel like I was very lucky.
Okay.
In that I had two excellent supervisors who have their research areas,
Right.
and what I wanted to do was within those. But then within that scope, I felt like I had a lot of freedom to do what I wanted and what I found interesting and what I thought was relevant. It's only kind of as I moved through the doctorate and through kind of my postgraduate roles, I sort of realised that I was sort of being pushed towards what I was choosing. So I thought I was choosing what to do, but it was influenced by probably what we would talk about in lab meetings and what other people were doing within the group. But ultimately, I think I was fairly free to do what I wanted within my doctorate, as long as it was relevant to kind of the decision making and gambling. And my supervisors were extremely supportive, and it was a brilliant environment actually to have done it. So
Okay, so moving back around to what it is that you are doing now and also did in some of your doctorate. Within gambling, we have the term disordered gambling. We'll speak about that quite a lot, but could you just define it to start with, just so...
Yeah, so I mean, disordered gambling is a relatively new term that is kind of used.
When was it?
So this came when the DSM-5 came. So the DSM-5 came out in...
Was it 2013?
2013, I think. So it's not that recent. But in terms of these things, it's relatively recent. And, we have lots of different screening tools that have put lots of different labels that have varying levels of appropriateness on gambling behaviour. So, you can have pathological, probable pathological, problem, that all kind of talk about the same thing. So disordered gambling was introduced as like a useful umbrella term to kind of encompass all those other terms to make sure we all are talking about the same thing. However, it's not a term that everyone likes. There's been quite a lot of criticism of the term because it still kind of puts the emphasis on the individual and saying it's the individual that has the problem, rather than kind of looking at the wider context. And the way that gambling's kind of provided and promoted. So
when I hear the word disorder, though, I don't necessarily think of problematic use. Is there a connection I'm missing, or is it just one of those semantic things?
And I mean, disorder was, I think it was initially kind of, we wanted to move away from the term problem more than anything else, because that's quite stigmatizing. So if somebody is experiencing gambling-related harm and you say, well, you're a problem gambler, that's quite a stigmatizing label. That's going to kind of have potential impacts on whether people want to come for treatment, whether they want to talk about their problems with their friends, with their family. So we definitely wanted to move away from that label. I think disordered, it's marginally better because it's not quite as stigmatizing as problem, but it's still not an ideal label in my view.
Okay, so we talk about how you mentioned how it was added to the DSM-5 in 2013. Why did it take so long for it to be considered a disorder?
Yes, good question. So generally, for disorders to be included in the various kind of medical manuals and DSM, the ICD, etc., they have to be supported by a certain weight of research.
Okay.
Now, there's a lot of research into substances, into kind of, like smoke and drugs outcomes, which is why those kind of behaviours are just included kind of without any question. Behavioural addictions are, in relation to the substance use disorders, they're a much kind of newer concept. So the kind of the body of evidence supporting kind of the ideology behind the disorder is much smaller, it's much weaker.
Okay.
There was a lot of neuroscientific kind of research looking at various kind of reward pathways and brain areas involved in gambling that we see overlaps with substance use disorders, and it's kind of the addition of that kind of literature to the wider literature base is what was kind of one of the catalysts for being able to include it. It's also why we don't see other things in there yet. So there's gaming disorder, there's various kind of people, we'll talk about exercise addiction as well as sex-related disorders.
So like all under the PIU kind of problematic internet use.
Yes, but again, the kind of the body of evidence supporting that is far smaller because it's a much newer thing.
Right.
So that's why things like that aren't included, whereas gambling is, because we do know a little bit more about gambling, even though there's still...
Okay. Is that because in order to be able to diagnose it, there needs to be a certain amount of research that's done to be able to... Does that make sense? Like, what's their apprehension in adding something that hasn't got a certain threshold of research?
I don't really know the
Yeah.
answer. is kind of the first thing. I don't know what the DSM or the ICD, what their specific thresholds are for the weight of evidence.
Yeah.
There just has to be enough, but what enough is, I couldn't tell you.
So within that, so the PGSI, that's almost like a question. Is that a bad way to say it? Questionnaire, or is that fair?
I mean, it's
How do we say it
call it
properly?
a screening.
Screening, right? I don't want to offend. That has to be introduced at the same time as a way to be able to diagnose, or is that the right screening tool?
It's interesting with the PGSI is
Right.
it's more a measure of the harm that is experienced because of gambling, and individuals completing the PGSI will be put in a risk category dependent on their answers. So either no risk, low risk, moderate risk, or problem gambler. That's one of the labels. So that screening tool is kind of used to categorize people based on their risk of harm associated with gambling.
So that's not a diagnosis stage.
I mean, it is used sometimes for diagnosis.
Okay.
But it wasn't. I believe I'm right in saying it wasn't initially designed to be a tool that was a diagnostic tool in the way that maybe the DSM criteria is.
So when it comes to disordered gambling, of the factors within gambling that kind of catalyze disordered gambling, what do you think is the most prevalent out of the illusion of control, so near misses kind of thing, chasing losses, being drawn to the uncertainty of it all, or prior diagnosed psychological issues?
I mean, all of the above are important to varying degrees in different individuals.
Right.
It's one of the things that, I mean, I guess you could argue this across all addictions, but one of the things that's very difficult with working in gambling is that it's very difficult to have one kind of generic overview. Lots of people are very, very different people who gamble on very, very different things for different reasons.
Right.
So if you think, for example, about the National Lottery, it's only one sort of twice a week now, but there is there's the potential to win an enormous sum of money, but the outcome resolution is pretty slow because you buy a ticket and then you wait for the draw, and then compare that to a slot machine where you can be spinning every few seconds, and then compare that again to poker where you're actively competing against another poker player.
Yeah,
like they're all labeled gambling, but they're very different activities when you kind of look at the psychological constructs involved and the rewards that are associated with them. So I think there's different kind of there's different things within different types of people that are attracted to different types of gambling, and it's very difficult to say that with any sort of they're not a homogenous group. Basically, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think. Well, when it comes to substances, so for example, I read that over half, roughly, of the adults 16 plus in the UK will gamble annually, and less than 1% of the UK population report severe gambling behaviours that warrant diagnosis of gambling disorder. When it comes to activities or substances, is there generally understood to exist a critical percentage of those experiencing addictive behaviour towards it before the actual substance or activity itself is classified as addictive?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and the short answer to the question is I don't know if there's a threshold that has to be reached.
Okay.
But what is interesting about that question is you highlight that 1% figure, but actually I feel like there's some kind of well-reported details of the problems with that 1% figure.
Right.
In they're generally done in surveys that are quite small samples. They only take one person per household. So even if you phone a household and someone's a gambler, but the person who's not gambling answers, then that will go down as that there's no gamblers in that household. It misses out places of mass occupancy dwellings, so like prisons, homeless shelters, university halls of residence, like all places where we know that there's likely to be elevated levels of gambling related harm. It doesn't include those. It's only, when you're looking at that kind of 1%, that's only very much the tip of the iceberg as well. So it's the people who would qualify under either the PGSI or the DSM as being kind of the most extreme end of gambling related harm. It doesn't include those that experience some level of harm, but it wouldn't reach that kind of clinical threshold for a diagnosis of disordered gambling.
Yeah.
When you think about those who are experiencing kind of lower levels of harm, you're kind of creeping up towards, I think it's between 4 and 7% of the population experience some level of harm. There's also quite a lot of literature showing that for every one person who's experiencing gambling-related harm, they influence, I think it's between like another 7 and 10 other people. So it's not just the individual that's harmed by the gambling, it's the people close to them as well. So when you then expand those numbers out, you start to see that actually gambling it's not a small problem, and the gambling-related harm can impact quite a wide range of people in quite a different number of ways, and with different degrees of severity.
So you mentioned those aren't captured, for example, within prisons, homeless shelters, student accommodation. I'm interested as well as to whether disordered gambling and the harms associated with it can be present in careers or industry with which there is associated a lot of risk behavior or gambling-like behavior, such as stock traders.
And yeah, absolutely. We would say, or I would consider that people who like investors, traders, absolutely, it's a risk because that's essentially what they're doing is gambling. I know that there are specific kind of support, or not support. There's specific companies who offer guidance and support to trading companies to the things to look out for their traders because they know they're at high risk. But it's also drawing on evidence from the clinic. It's also used to be people working in industries with lots of cash and perhaps a lot of kind of a bit more kind of free time, but particularly cash was something that was a risk factor. So we used to see like a lot of taxi drivers because they would have access to quite a lot of cash, but then would also have times where they were idling maybe. So they would be able to just go into the bookmakers and bet. So it's interesting. There's different risk factors that are sort of more and less prevalent for different groups at different times.
Yeah, because I saw mention in one of the papers that a lot of these bookies, if that's the right word, can be shelter for homeless. A lot of them sometimes are open for like 24 hours and can be somewhere for them to...
So that comes specifically from a piece of work that we did looking at the prevalence of gambling disorder in homeless populations. Yep. And it was basically when we looked at the type of forms of gambling that the homeless individual was focused on, and it tended to be stuff centered around slot machines. Okay. Not so much actually the actual bookie shops. It was more the arcades, that things like Quicksilver and Casino and things like that are open 24 hours a day. And they also have some of those places have relatively low stake machines. If you don't have an enormous amount to gamble with, you could still go in and legitimately be somewhere that was kind of warm and dry, which is obviously in months like this when it's very, very cold, it was very, very dangerous to be outside overnight. Being in somewhere where you can be warm and safe and dry is obviously eminently preferable. Yeah. But the kind of the conditions, you have to be gambling while you're in there.
So, and when it comes to those forms, because you mentioned slot machines, do you find that the most addictive forms of gambling are those that exhibit near miss behavior?
Not always. Okay. Actually, it's just, as I said before, like different people can have problems or cancer. I shouldn't say that. I'll start that one again. As we said before, it's different people are attracted to different types of gambling. Yeah. So the near miss is just one feature that is prominent in slot machine gambling that is potentially important for people who may be experiencing issues with slot machines. But then there's other things. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the poker players. We tend to find poker players that are very strong kind of numerically. They like the competitive edge. But then there's also, things like, I personally used to think that the fixed odds betting terminals were so appealing to people because they kind of very much had a feature that we described as a loss disguised as a win,
Right.
which is where you might stake £20 on the spin, you spin it, you win £10. So objectively, overall, you've lost. But the machine will kind of say, you have won £10. So it feels like you won a little bit rather than lost a little bit.
Right.
And that's a very kind of powerful reinforcer of behavior.
Have you tried seeing? Because obviously we've got all the lights, we've got the noises, the voices. It's not just don't just give the money to someone, wait in a room with no sensory stimulation, and then find out what do we know how much each of those factors are influencing that addictive behavior?
Not individually, I don't think. I mean, there's some research around kind of sensory stimulation, but not an enormous amount. But I think what's most interesting for me in that sense is when you kind of look at the casinos, it's almost more like they want to take away that not sensory deprivation. Obviously, that would be ridiculous. But in a casino, you won't find any clocks. You don't really find any windows. And just the casinos, particularly in Vegas, we experienced this. We saw it in action when I was over there.
Yeah.
They do bring drinks, they do bring food, but it's very non-meal specific. So, at 8 o'clock in the morning, they're not going to bring out breakfast baps and cups of coffee. They're just going to bring out very, very kind of plain, could have eaten any time food. Because in the casinos particularly, there's an interest in getting gamblers to kind of not really have a sharp sense of time and how much time they've spent there. So anything that kind of reduces that and just makes everything seem kind of very sort of one level and consistent, and that's the kind of stuff that's provided. And I think that's really, really interesting. Related to that, there is one other thing that's I guess is important related to that, and it can be seen in casinos, it can be seen in bookies, it can be seen anywhere really, is something called the coaction effect, where you see other people winning. And there's plenty of studies that kind of show that that's actually quite important. So if you're sitting on a slot machine and you hear somebody win the jackpot, that's likely to make you want to carry on gambling more because you've heard that a win can happen.
Which I assume is why those near misses are kind of attractive, because they can stimulate that win effect without actually paying
the near misses are they're much more kind of, they have an impact on an individual level rather than kind of watching what someone else is doing. So it depends on kind of the psychological theories behind the near miss that you kind of are influenced by. So some near misses are maybe reflective of increased skill, getting closer to achieving your desired outcome. Now, obviously, on the lottery, that's not a thing. Like even if you're next to a couple of numbers that come out, there's no skill involved in that, and there's no kind of, that's no indication of what's happened. Is no indication of what's going to come next. Whereas if you're betting on football, for example, and you pick 5 teams to win, and 4 of them win and the other one draws, you might start to think, oh, okay, I studied those fixtures, I studied the form, I looked at who was home, who's away, who's strong at home, who's away. I've picked out the teams that I think are going to win. And if you almost get close to winning, there's an argument that is indicative of skill. So if you're getting better, that may influence your future performance. However, there's studies with different kind of results about whether sports betting is skill-based.
Right.
But yeah, the skill element in the near miss is kind of quite important.
I'm assuming then, bringing it back to those casinos, would they have psychologists on their side as well? Not that there's necessarily sides, but you know what I mean? They must have people who they sponsor to research how they can...
I should definitely start this answer by saying I don't know for a fact, but I would be very, very surprised if game designers weren't heavily influenced by psychology, because some of the way that some of the products are designed is very smart from a psychological perspective, the way that they're designed to hook people in and keep people there. I mean, we talk about this quite a lot in that one of the primary aims of the industry is to make losing fun, because people have to lose more than they win. That's kind of the basis of the entire industry.
Yeah.
But why would an individual continue to engage in a behavior if they were constantly losing and saying, well, this isn't fun? They wouldn't want to carry on doing it.
Right.
So the industry has to be creative in the ways that they can make losing fun. And that's I think that's probably where the psychologists come into designing the games and the features and for the overall aesthetic of the products.
I think it's interesting as well. I know we're mentioning losing, but even the winning side, I wonder what percentage of big wins in gambling is recouped by the gambling industry anyway. Because from a lot of videos I've been watching online of people telling their stories with problematic and harms of gambling, they win big and then immediately think, okay, well, I'm pretty good at this, or along those lines. I want that, or they chase that high again, or whatever the reason might be. All that money that they've won, a lot of those times gets fed straight back in to try.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, it very much depends on the individual and how they are in that moment.
Okay.
So, I mean, I know people who were poker players who were able to win tournaments and then kind of walk away with the winnings and kind of be content for a while. Whereas with other work, sometimes with the treatment-seeking gamblers, they would often say, like, the worst thing that can happen is a win, because whatever happens, I'm going to go to the shop and I am going to gamble until all my money is gone. So winning just prolonged that experience, because they just would gamble and gamble and gamble until everything was gone. And it's kind of that kind of mindset of, right, well, I had £100, I've now got 1,000, but just think about that. If I had 1,000, that could be 10,000. And it's that mentality of kind of never having won enough. And always thinking, well, I can get more. Or for example, if you're looking at superstitions, you might think, okay, this is my lucky day today, so why would I waste this hot streak? I'm going to carry on.
We'll get more into online gambling as well, but on online gambling, there's reality checks. I'm not a gambler online, so I didn't even know what the term was. So essentially, if I understand it correctly, it's about being able to see the amount of time spent on a site. Do you think that's effective?
Well, I can actually, so I gamble a little bit, and I can answer this question from my own experience as a gambler. No, utterly useless. Yeah. So I bet on a particular app, and if I log in and I put a bet on, then I put my phone in my pocket. If I take my phone out of my pocket a couple of hours later to check a score or to see how the bet's doing, it will say, you've been logged in for 2 hours. Right. And I will cross that without even really reading what it says, and then it's gone. And then I will, and I can set them, I think I've got them set so they pop up every half an hour. And actually, for me, that's too frequent. They're just annoying. So I just cross them out as soon as I see them and don't even pay them any attention. So, I mean, that's my personal experience. Yeah. And for other people, it might be, a useful reminder of, I have been logged in for quite a long time, perhaps I should stop now. I wonder if it's actually it depends on the kind of thing that you're doing online. So if I was constantly playing a slot machine or playing roulette, and something popped up and said, you have now been solidly gambling for 2 hours, then that might make me think, oh, okay, that's quite a long time. But because I'm sports betting and I'm putting my phone down, I'm going to do other things for half an hour, I'm coming back looking at it, that's meaningless to me, that pop-up telling me I've been logged in for half an hour.
When it comes to, because am I right in thinking that a lot of these sites have those kind of features and like gamble aware stuff because of legislation in place telling them that it should be on? Or
yes and no. So, I mean, some of the companies are better than others at providing safer gambling features. And a lot of we've seen this with other industries in the past, other potentially hazardous industries, that the industry themselves will put some measures in place to ward off potential stronger regulation from an independent regulator. Okay. So for the industries to be able to turn around and say, look, we've put reality checks in, we've put deposit limits in, you don't need to do any more to restrict what we can do. We've done it ourselves. And that's kind of, I think that's kind of where we are at the moment, is that the industry is sort of I mean, there is some minimum requirements as well from the Gambling Commission, and as part of licensing conditions, I think I might be saying that they have to kind of do some minimum standards. But again, it varies across the industry how well they're kind of done.
So when it comes to government legislation, let's say for the UK government, if they put legislation in place, I don't know what they have in place, but let's say they put certain rules in place. When it comes to that kind of thing, what extent do you believe those are in place for moral reasons, because they genuinely care about, they're genuinely trying to help people who are gambling to maintain a public image / make people, you'd be like, oh, they've done something, carry on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, in terms of the legislators, then the legislators want the industry that they're legislating to stay kind of clean. Like I think the Gambling Commission has some stated objectives of keeping gambling free from crime, protecting vulnerable populations. So they're very kind of clear objectives. When it comes to the actual gambling companies themselves, there's this kind of balance that they have to strike in that they are essentially profit-making businesses. Lots of them are listed, they have shareholders, so they have an obligation to kind of maximize their profits to get the best returns for their shareholders. But at the same time, you have to balance that with the kind of the protection of the very people that are your customers. And I would say that I think probably some companies do that better than others. Even within certain companies, some of them do some fairly strong work actually on player protection, but there's still a law you will see from the Gambling Commission that's still issuing multiple big fines for people who are breaking the rules. But to be honest, the kind of the legislation side of stuff is not my sort of area of expertise. So I don't know as much as perhaps I should on that.
So, in New Zealand, they have the levies in place. So what, am I correct in understanding essentially if you are a gambling company within New Zealand, a certain percentage of the money you make gets put into a commission or company that then invests in the harms associated with disordered gambling, essentially. That's the point of it.
I think so. First, so over here, our model is slightly different.
Okay.
Currently, it's a voluntary contribution from everyone who has a license. So every operator makes a voluntary contribution towards research, education, and treatment.
Right.
So they can make a contribution that goes to Gambleware, and then Gambleware then distribute those funds for research, education, and treatment. And the problem with our current system is that it's voluntary. So there's always that potential for the gambling industry to say, actually, no, we're not going to give this to Gambleware. We're going to give it to someone else. And it actually happened recently. There was a pledge to the top kind of gambling companies were going to contribute an extra £100 million towards research, education, and treatment. And then there was a new story recently where their kind of trade body had said, actually, no, we're going to give a certain proportion of this to other things that we want to fund. So you're already getting 75 billion, which it was just, for me, it seemed like that was just a little muscle flex to say, this is what we can do if we want. So what we would actually want in terms of taking things forward, it would be better, I think, if the levy was not voluntary, because then that takes away any kind of potential for kind of conflict or influence.
What would be what would be a reasonable percentage? Is it likely to be?
I know there was talk over here, and I can't remember if this comes from New Zealand, of a smart levy. So not everyone pays the same thing. So it depends what kind of products you are providing as an operator.
Right.
What kind of proportion of your incomes come from specific products.
Yeah.
So, for example, a small independent bookmaker who relies solely on money taken at the racetrack, their liability is going to be much, 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 much smaller than somebody who is an online gambler. Online provider, only providing slots and roulette and stuff. So those kind of products that are considered generally to be more high risk, if you make more of your money from your high risk products, then you're going to have a higher levy to pay.
How, when it comes to online gambling, so, we're talking about like registering as a gambling company within a country. Do online gambling if you're an internet gambler, is that necessarily associated with a location? If that location isn't in the UK, people can still access it from the UK. How is that?
I mean, pretty much anything's accessible. So the study that we did recently looking at crypto casinos, there are certain sites that you can't access from the UK, but all you have to do is just use a VPN and you can put yourself somewhere where you are able to access those.
Right.
You can access pretty much anything. Okay. So it's very difficult actually to kind of have any kind of control over what sites people can access. And that's not just for gambling, that's for anything.
Yeah. So would you think the aim shouldn't necessarily be in regulation, but education and resources available for those experiencing? Because I would assume it's going to be one of those things that if the grips get tighter and people who take part don't necessarily like the way it affects what they're using, they will just move to more fringe.
Well, that's kind of what the Betting and Gaming Council, the BGC, who are kind of a trade group, lobby group for the industry. That's kind of one of the things that they always kind of try to argue is that if we over legislate the kind of the white label industry over here, then it will push people towards the black markets.
In terms of regulation, obviously it's not just the casinos themselves, it's the advertising and the sponsorship and all of that stuff. When it comes to advertising and sponsorship, how damaging do you think the concept of responsible gambling is in, marginalizing those experiencing it?
The term responsible gambling has come under quite a lot of fire at the moment, simply because by promoting responsible gambling, you are by kind of implication sort of suggesting that those who are experiencing harm are irresponsible gamblers. Right. And that in itself is sort of, it can be, again, it varies across individuals, but that can be kind of seen as kind of stigmatizing and adding to this kind of the sense of shame that's associated with experiencing gambling harm. So we would kind of try to move away from talking about responsible gambling. And I believe that's what the Gambling Commissioners try to do. Like, they don't talk about responsible gambling anymore. They talk about safer gambling.
Okay.
But there's an interesting kind of journey behind that phrase, in that I think everyone said it in Australia, it sort of started off as the responsible provision of gambling. Then it became responsible gambling. Then it became gamble responsibly. And then more recently, we've seen play responsibly. So it's really interesting how that language has shifted over the years to kind of move the emphasis away from the operator and placing it kind of squarely on the shoulders of the individual.
On language as well, I found it interesting. I was reading the paper you did for the crypto casinos and accessing VPN. The language used in some of those gamble-aware pages, or the gamble responsibly pages, where some of them were saying gambling is fun, but it can all of this stuff. How important is the language used around it? I mean,
yeah, absolutely, it's massively important. So we talk about this a lot in that in most kind of industry communications, and to be honest, in some academic papers, and it can permeate everywhere.
Yeah.
But particularly within industry communications, you will rarely see the words gambling, gambler. They would always talk about players and playing games rather than gamblers gambling. But this is actually, it's one of the areas that I think lots of us aren't great at, and it's one of the reasons why we are trying to get better and better at involving those with lived experience of harm kind of within the stuff that we do, so that we can be better guided on what appropriate language is to talk about the behaviour and the people who kind of engage in the behaviour.
How integral do you think the relationship is between sports and gambling?
I mean, it's in all sports at the moment. Like, we're looking at some stuff at the moment around gambling and football. I mean, obviously, football being the most prominent example because it's played by so many, it's watched by so many. I think there's actually, I'm right in saying there's slightly less teams sponsored by a gambling company this year than there was last year in the Premier League. But, the last few years, we've been at a stage where we have a saturation of one industry sponsoring clubs in the Premier League and the
It got up
Championship.
to
It was
like
higher
10
than we've ever seen.
in the Championship, wasn't it? Like 16 out of 24 or
16
something.
and 2 or 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was something like there was a guaranteed, I can't remember what it was, a guaranteed number of fixtures every week would have all 22 players, the gambling companies on their shirts.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, it's not just that. So what's something that's really interesting about this is that if you watch a game of football, once you are kind of aware of the gambling advertising, you will start to see just how prevalent it is across a broadcast. So it may be, there might be shirt sponsors. There will be on the advertising boards, and then sometimes on the interviews after the game, like the temporary little boards they put up around the little interview rooms, that's going to have gambling logos on as well.
Yep.
So it's fairly constant, the reminder that you can gamble on this game.
Because they're big injections of money into a lot of those teams, though, aren't they? Because I think, what was it? In Italy, there was a ban on it all. And then there was a lot of teams complaining about how that left them in a really bad place.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. Like I think the Italian ban on run saying it was put in place and then it wasn't instant. Like they were allowed to the end of the season or the end of the next season.
And then that got extended as well, I think. Yeah.
So COVID then affected that because obviously teams' finances were hugely hit. So they had to. Yeah. But there's another interesting point around that Rob Davis from The Guardian makes is that let's say your contract with the sponsorship with the gambling companies worth £1 million.
Yeah.
If you're not allowed to have the gambling company as your sponsor, you don't lose £1 million. You lose a difference to the next highest potential sponsor. Okay. It is a non-gambling company.
Yeah.
So that could be 950,000 the value of that contract. So you're only actually losing £50,000, and you're not losing £1 million. And so
supposing there's no shortage of
sports would survive if gambling sponsorship was taken away. Gambling company money was taken out. Like the example that's often cited is tobacco in Formula One, and it was kind of uproar around that. So Formula One will not survive without tobacco industry, sponsorship and funding. It survived.
Really?
It's fine. So there would be some difficulties, and it's not something that you could just snap fingers and stop overnight. There would need to be, I think, sort of a managed exit of gambling from football sponsorship. But football will find ways of making money.
Yeah. Do you think? Because I'm thinking more about exposure to those children, essentially, people under the age of 18. Because do you think it should be taken away for that factor? Because it's not, football especially, there's a huge youth following for that. And even when they do the watershed between 5 minutes before, 5 minutes after, no gambling, like you say, shirts and the amount of kids that can name gambling companies because they are watching sports is much higher. Would that be the main factor motivating a ban on it? Or
I mean, yeah, there's quite a lot of research showing, some from Australia and some from over here, showing kind of the influence on younger supporters and the fact that quite young kids are able to name numerous gambling brands because of the exposure to top level sports. But also what it does is it kind of normalizes gambling as part of that sport. And that's something that I guess we would absolutely not want that to be the case. We want to move away from that.
Moving round to, we're looking at disordered gambling and the harms and the consequences. Can you explain the significance of the correlation between disordered gambling and attempted and successful suicide attempts? Because I think when I, not to sound cold, but when I read it at first, it felt like it would be somewhat obvious that addictive behavior towards a certain thing would cause that certain result. However, then I kind of reflected and thought, things like tobacco and smoking is addictive, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's a correlation between that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess gambling is different from substance use disorders in a number of ways. Not least, you can hide it. So if you've got a substance use disorder, then there's going to be kind of relatively obvious physiological symptoms that people will be able to pick up on.
Yeah.
Gambling, they're often not there
Yeah.
because it's a behaviour rather than the substance use disorder. And the other thing that's really sets gambling apart, I think, in my mind from everything else is the sheer speed that you lose money and the devastating consequences. I mean, they're sometimes referred to as legacy harms. Like someone can stop gambling, but it can take years and years and years to undo the harms that are associated with what essentially can be a relatively short binge or a short kind of episode of disordered gambling. But in terms of kind of the relationship with gambling and suicide, like we know that gamblers generally don't seek treatment at all. Well, this is a bit of a generalization, but working with treatment providers, we often find that gamblers seek treatment once they reach a crisis point.
Right.
So that will be either like a giant loss, maybe something to do with losing a house or the kind of a breakdown of a relationship. Mm-hmm. And it's often, we often find this, having worked with treatment providers, that it's when the extent of the problems, the extent of the harms are sort of become clear, it's not even necessarily the gambling behaviour itself that is what the affected others have so much of an issue with. It's kind of like the lies and the deceit and the sneaking around that is more of a problem. So, you have instances of people taking out credit cards in other people's names or stealing from family and things like that.
Money
and it's often those associated behaviours that cause more kind of damage to the relationships. And interestingly, a piece of work we did looking at kind of predictors of suicide attempts, actually gambling severity and the amount of money lost wasn't actually a significant predictor of whether somebody would have attempted suicide because of gambling. It was more kind of the breakdown of support networks. So if someone had lost a house, lost a job, lost relationship with families, lost a partner, lost access to children, it was those sort of, not so much children actually, that was not so really looked at.
Okay.
But it was the kind of the breakdown of the support networks that showed that when people then reached that crisis point, they had nowhere to turn because they kind of burnt all the bridges through various customers.
So it's that isolation.
Absolutely, right. The isolation. And I think that's where gambling tends to be sort of different from substance use disorders.
Does it, as an addictive behavior, though, have a similar effect in terms of the endorphins released, like mentally, the stimulation that it has? Because I was reading that study where they were doing the brain scanning and comparing it to. There was one that mentioned how it's similar, the stimulation caused in the brain to when. Okay, so to explain the study, essentially it was people who had experienced gambling problems, disordered gambling, essentially, and then also you had a control group, and they would sit them down in a room and place brain scanning on their heads, and then they would be presented with some images, some that stimulate, gambling. So, for example, like a casino roulette, and then control images, and then also I think the comparison was with sweet foods and the control images for that, and comparing the brain activity to a similar study in which it was done to people addicted to cocaine. Similar brain stimulation was caused.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see. Yeah, so that's called cue reactivity. We see there's parallels between kind of substance use disorders and behavioural addiction in the way that people experiencing harm respond to cues. Mm-hmm. We see when they engage in the behaviour or experience the behaviour, there's kind of the similar kind of reward mechanisms and reward pathways are activated as well. Yep. So that kind of circles back to what we were talking about with the burden of evidence, and in terms of that being formally recognised within various statistical diagnostic manuals. That is that kind of stuff that we're looking at, kind of that comparisons between the sort of the reward pathways and the reward circuitry that's activated when you engage in the behaviours. I know the study you're talking about, and I think I'm right in saying I took some of the photos that we used in that study.
Interesting.
That was some of my colleagues at the time that were kind of needed.
Yeah, because it was a mixture of purchased stock photos and photos taken. Yeah.
Yeah, that was us wandering around Cambridge taking photos of bookmakers.
Love that. Yeah, sometimes you got to get out on the field. That's it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Okay, so at this moment in time, what is your research focused on? What are you exploring as we speak?
My main stuff at the moment is looking at what we call the within-game constructs. So things like stake size, speed of play, near misses.
Right.
I'm looking at those kind of elements of different types of gambling and how they impact on behaviour. But we are kind of, the way I'm doing that is attempting to kind of evolve the experimental paradigms that we use to understand behaviour. So what I mean by that is more often than not, traditionally, if you're going to do a gambling experiment, you program a slot machine task on a PC, put someone in a psychology testing room, get them to press buttons on the keyboard and go, well, that's sort of like gambling, and this is how behaviour changes.
Yeah.
Now, some of the critics of that kind of work will say that it lacks what we call ecological validity.
Right.
It's not representative at all of the actual behaviour you're trying to investigate.
Yeah.
So what we're doing is using virtual reality to increase the ecological validity of the environment in which the behaviour is performed. So we'll get people to come in, put a headset on, would have built a casino or a bookmakers or a racetrack. And we will get participants to engage in their behaviour in a much more realistic environment, and then keep that kind of experimental approach and still kind of manipulate one variable within the testing session and see how that influences behaviour. Now, the point of that is obviously to kind of provide a solid evidence base when it comes to legislating specific products. So if there is things like, oh, should we change the minimum and maximum stake? Should we change the speed that the products are allowed to kind of be gambled on? We will have a solid evidence base to be able to say, okay, if you change it by X amount, this will reduce gambling. If you reduce it to this will increase. So yeah, if we're aiming to be able to be in a good position to kind of inform legislation going forward around the way products are constructed.
I've worn a VR headset before, so I know how immersive it does feel. Is there, apart from bringing people to a casino itself, would that be seen unethical if you put someone in a casino?
Yes.
It would.
It would be very difficult for me to get ethical clearance to take people to a casino. You do often get things, there is occasionally what we call naturalistic studies where you just observe people kind of in the actual environment. And they tend to be difficult for two reasons with gambling. One is that, unsurprisingly, gambling companies aren't super keen on researchers going in and monitoring what people are doing in the casinos. It's actually quite difficult. Even when we were at UEL, when the big Aspers opened, they absolutely shut down any conversation because we wanted to film just a bank of slot machines to use as in the virtual environment, and they absolutely wouldn't let us at all.
Right.
The other thing with naturalistic studies is that you absolutely lose the experimental control. So I might be watching what one person does and monitoring their heart rate, for example, or their skin conductance in response to different outcomes. And then suddenly somebody wins jackpot over there. And that's going to influence how they behave. It's going to influence the kind of their physiological reactions to that rather than what they're looking at. Whereas when you've got somebody in a lab, obviously that doesn't happen. You've got much greater experimental control. So it's striking that balance between it being as realistic as possible, but still retaining the control over the environment.
What about physically reconstructing the environment, like in a little room?
Yeah, so that's what we actually did with the first VR study. We did. I had a slot machine case with buttons and stuff.
Yeah.
People still wore the headset, so what they could see was in the environment and was in the virtual environment.
Yeah.
But what they were touching was physically there in front of them, but also represented within the environment. So it kind of had that haptic sense as well as the kind of the visual and audio stinger.
So you wouldn't go as far to recreate like a little mini casino setting?
I mean, that does happen.
It does,
actually,
even with like the darkness and the lights.
In some research facilities, they will have kind of like a room that's set up to do a mock casino
and fake actors as well in there, because you were talking about how it can stimulus from other people playing. Or
it depends what you're looking at. I mean, if you wanted to look at the coaction effect, then that would be a way to do that. But if you're just looking at what's happening on the actual slot machine, then you wouldn't need other people.
How do you as researchers avoid doing the same research? I mean, there's only so much you can do, I guess.
Yeah,
but
we don't actually.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a bad thing if independent groups are looking at the same thing, because if there's a group in Canada, a group in Australia, a group in the UK, we're looking at the same stuff, and completely independently we come to the same conclusion. That's great. Like just being able to replicate those kind of findings across different independent groups is positive.
I guess maybe it might be more difficult in the nature of these studies, but do you ever find it easy, perhaps easy is not the right word, to lose sight of the real human beings beyond all the numbers and the data? And
there's different answers to that depending on what kind of data you're looking at. So if you are working with huge anonymized aggregated data sets, that is, I guess it is easier to forget that you're actually looking at real people and real stories, because you're just looking at massive spreadsheets worth of numbers. Whereas if you're doing different kind of studies, like I did a qualitative study where I went out and interviewed 20 homeless gamblers and spent anything from 1 to 3 hours just sitting in a room, just chatting about their lives and their entire histories. And that is very affecting. And that's very, they're hard to listen to sometimes, actually, some of those stories. So it very much depends on the type of study that you do. And I think it's a really important thing to think about, actually, because it is really important to always keep in mind that these are real people with real lives and real issues and real harms that we're researching. So as much as it's a research project, it really does have, working with real life stuff. So it's important to keep that in mind.
So, Dr. Sharman, I appreciate your time. At the end of my episodes, I want to ask all my guests the same question.
Okay.
Because I can see how the answer varies across. And I was spending a lot of time over the past few days thinking exactly what that question. It might be subject to change.
Right.
But, we've spoken about a lot of harmful effects and harmful ways of living and the damage that can be done. Based not necessarily from your research, but from your own experience, what do you think are the key ingredients to living a fulfilling life?
The key ingredients to living a fulfilling life, I have to think about what makes me happy. Just creating time for the things that are important to you. So for me, that's and I have a wife and 2 small children. So for me, it's being able to spend time with them. So also, I guess it's keeping kind of your interests varied as well. Like I try not to let my work take over my whole life. Like I try to keep my emails completely off at the weekends, so I can spend time. I go running, I spend time with my children, and then when they go to bed, I spend some time with my wife. And it's just that, really, just making time. I guess the short answer is making time for the things that are important to you.
Amazing. Thank you for
that. Good answer.
There is no right answer to this.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure. I mean,
I'm going to probably think about that for the rest of the day.
We'll see. I think it'll be interesting to see how that varies across other people in different fields. And yeah, but no, there is no real right answer to it. It's going to be different, isn't it?
Do you know what? The first thing that came to mind was money.
Yeah.
If you have some money, and that is ridiculous, because that is the appeal of gambling.
Yeah.
Like, money does just make life easier.
It removes base
the stress,
problems, doesn't it? Yeah.
It removes the
definitely
stress.
an extent.
I mean, things are getting a little bit more tough again now, obviously, and it's worrying about overdrafts and when bills are going to come in and go out, and oh no, an MOT if it fails, what are we going to do? Like, those kind of stresses they're always there, and they're always negative impacts on your life. And if you don't have those financially, it doesn't necessarily make life better. It just makes it less worse, which is probably a very
removing those base
way of
level
looking at
problems and base level stresses, because there's obviously must be a critical threshold at which I think the research, I don't know how out of date it is, but there was research done that suggested around 80,000 a year as a single individual. So this isn't with was above that. There wasn't huge leaps in satisfaction and happiness. because it does make sense for there to be critical, but it would be silly to say that money is not anything, because there is
I mean,
so many
it's
problems.
not everything, but
Yeah,
it certainly makes some things easier.
100%, 100%. Well, I appreciate your time.
Allegedly.
Yeah, well, there we go.
Yeah, it's a really fun.
There you go. Thank you for your time.
Cool.
I really appreciate it.